Alright, what's going on, guys? In a time where the majority of players have already beaten Elden Ring's DLC, conquered that brutal final boss, and are now experimenting with subsequent playthroughs, that leads to one very fun thing. Discoveries, new and exciting details that you wouldn't otherwise come across. So today we have 8 new ones to share. And by now, I'm sure you guys know how these videos go. If I show you something today that you didn't already know, then be sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe if you're new around here. But with all that, let's get straight into it. In the world of Elden Ring, color is very significant, and areas, factions, and disciplines are commonly characterized by a certain tone. We have purple gravity magic, golden incantations, among others like the god-slaying black flame. But one that you might be very familiar with is the red lightning of the ancient dragons. However, the DLC actually introduced a new variant of this, with orange ancient dragon lightning, wielded by the dragons of the Jagged Peak, and Bale the Dread himself. Now you probably saw this orange ancient dragon lightning and thought, man, I wish I could use that. Well, as it turns out, you can. Kind of. If you go to the very base of the Jagged Peak, between the Dragon Communion altar and the first Spirit Spring jump, at sunset exactly, then you too will be able to cast orange ancient dragon lightning, and it looks really cool. Now this works for all ancient dragon lightning spells, giving them that bright orange color, just like the dragons of the area. And I'll have a comparison on screen of what the normal version looks like compared to the orange lightning version. It's a pretty stark change, but if you're wondering why the requirements to make this happen are so weird, well that's because unfortunately in all reality, it's likely just a lighting glitch. The DLC uses a lot of interesting skyboxes and color tuning in order to achieve its atmosphere, so the most probable explanation here is that the color mode for the sunset in this specific area makes the lightning have this hue. But the fact that this is the right lightning for the effect, in the right area, does mean this could be a cool little Easter egg they hid, and I think that's a much more fun idea. One of the most striking areas in all of the DLC is Shaman Village, Queen Marika's original home. And if you're like me, when you saw this name you likely thought, that's a pretty unnatural word. What exactly does the word shaman connotate in Elden Ring's world? Now the word shaman in English has to do with someone who's into mysticism, or the practice of communing with spirits. But the Japanese name for this village uses the word Miko instead. Now it's important to note that there is no problem with translating that as shaman. However, Miko is a bit more specific. Much like shaman is a sort of job description, a Miko is a Japanese shrine maiden. Now why does that matter? Well, the difference is that shaman can be both a masculine and feminine thing, but a Miko is a woman's job. So the name in Japanese would imply that it's a village of women, and that is significant in the lore, as when you look at the so-called shamans in the jars, they do all seem to be women. And we can build one more really cool connection off this. We've talked before about the trees in Inir Ilim being made of bodies, but one specific thing to note about them is that these two are all women, and given that the grandmother in the village has seemingly turned into a tree, there's a mystery to solve here. Couple that with obviously Marika's creation of the Erdtree, and what exactly does that mean for the shamans? I think all these connections are well worth a deep dive. Now before we move on, let me tell you guys about something real cool that I've been working on for a while. This is Undisputed, a manga style comic that I've been cooking up for the past 4 months alongside Nicholas Pedro, whose art you'll likely recognize from here on the channel. The story follows Jori, a Georgian MMA fighter, as he chases the undisputed title, but finds himself caught up in corrupt business dealings that will soon uproot his entire career and make his climb for the belt much more complicated. We just published chapter 1 over on Webtoons, and it would really mean a lot if you guys would go check it out. You can read it absolutely free. You don't even have to make an account. But my goal with the series is to tell a really cool story while also communicating realistic and practical MMA fights where you can look at the technique on the page and that kind of thing would work in real life. So I'll have that link down in the description and pinned comment. Y'all go show some love, but now back to the video. Elden Ring DLC innovated on a lot of weapons, introducing new ones in more ways than just the new weapon types. But an example of this that I never really knew about are new weapons with a native element that can be further enhanced. For example, I have here the Black Steel Great Hammer, and it has intrinsic holy damage. Now normally, weapons that have an intrinsic element like that cannot be the recipient of elemental buffs. However, if you look at the item description, you'll notice that it says further holy imbuement will amplify the effect and greatly increase the armament's power. And you can see here that I can actually apply holy grease to the black steel great hammer, even though it already does holy damage. But what you may not have realized about these types of weapons are that this goes for any and all buffs. As you can see here, I have the black steel twin blade, which also talks about further holy imbuement, but I can also apply magic grease to this weapon, causing it to have 3 damage types at once. Now normally I wouldn't recommend actually using magic instead of holy on this thing, as like the description says, the holy actually stacks together causing a big damage buff, while the magic imbuement seems to split the damage, not really giving much of an increase. But this could be practical in a scenario where an enemy is resistant to holy, but weak to magic. Some other weapons with this hidden effect are the Fire Knight weapons, which gain additional power from fire imbuments. And surprisingly, there was a weapon from the base game that had this effect, but never mentioned it, that being the Clayman's Harpoon, which does magic damage but can also be buffed. So if you've been using these weapons, make sure you're giving them that extra kick of power, which can make them even stronger. But now let's talk about some lore, turning our attention to Midra, an unwanting Lord of Frenzied Flame. For as much as this guy suffered, one thing we'll notice about him is that even though he does transform into a Lord of Frenzied Flame, he lacks the marks of one who's communed with the 3 fingers. However, one thing we've covered before in this series is that beneath the covered tarps behind the painting, we'll find a collection of finger stones, which led to some interesting theories that he or Nanaya may have been trying to create their own fingers in order to establish that communion to the outer god. But another interesting detail to go along with that lies in his arena, because did you know the ground where Midra awakens is covered in fingerprints? So even if he himself was not grabbed by the 3 fingers, their influence is here. But what does this mean exactly? Well, I think it would suggest that the Flame of Frenzy operates in a much more complex manner than simply extending its purchase through the 3 fingers alone. To become afflicted by the Flame of Frenzy is one thing, but to actually rise as a lord is much more mysterious. So did Midra commune with the 3 fingers in a way different than what we undergo in the base game? These fingerprints certainly cause me to wonder about that, and it's a very fascinating detail. A fight that was certainly not at the top of my tier list of favorite bosses in the DLC was Jori the Elder Inquisitor. I gotta be honest, I found the fight pretty annoying, and the fact that these are just common enemies later on takes away some of the luster. But did you know our friend Jori here was likely supposed to be a Remembrance boss? That's right, if we look in the files, we have an extra Remembrance icon of an Inquisitor along with a big boy beside him. And considering that Jori is the only boss Inquisitor we find, well, do the math. And I don't think it takes a genius to figure out why this one was cut. This boss fight is not Remembrance level at all, and I don't know about you, but I certainly would have been disappointed to receive a Remembrance after beating this one. But are there any of you out there that think Jori is deserving of a Remembrance? You let me know. One of the poster children of the DLC is of course Needle Knight Leda, the extreme Miquella loyalist who has no problem killing her friends in his name. But the term Needle Knight is a very creative one, and I found it interesting. But her armor tells us that the Needle Knights were fashioned to be Miquella's needles to ward away all. However, there's a pretty cool little detail that may also earn her this namesake. Did you ever notice the little needle that's on Leda's helmet? I certainly didn't, because it's so small that 99% of the time when you're playing the game, you're never going to see it beyond a few pixels. And you may be thinking, well, that's cool, but why would she ever have a needle on this part of her helmet? Well, this is actually a little peg that used to be commonplace on old knight helmets like this. These pegs were there so that you could lift the face coverings when wearing cumbersome gauntlets, making them much easier to grab instead of the smooth covering itself. Now, normally the shape on the end would be a ball, but of course for the Needle Knight, they made hers a needle. Now you'll notice that not all the knight helmets have this, and Leda's appears to be much more unique. So I guess they just thought it'd be a cool detail to add, to give her that extra bit of sophistication. In the last Discoveries video, we talked about Feints, the secret ability that some weapons have to cancel a charged R2 by pressing the dodge button, which transforms the attack into a sort of dodge with a simultaneous attack. And in that video, we showcased how the Great Katanas had a new feint, and I thought these were the only DLC weapons that got this. However, you guys were quick to point out to me that they're not, and in fact, some other weapon types get feints as well, those being the Beast Claws and the Perfume Bottles. and as well as the small throwable weapons. In the case of the Beast Claws, this gives you a big backward jump, along with a front swipe, and is probably the most useful of the feints. The perfume bottles have a backwards jump that throws the perfume in the area you jump from. Decent enough for dodging, but likely hard to actually land the attack. And the throwables just have a small backstep that really isn't very useful. You just sort of pivot off the back foot. Pretty underwhelming, especially when you're dealing with a ranged weapon. But it does cause the projectile to arc to the left, which I guess could have some utility, but it's not enough to make a difference in my opinion. Regardless though, if you use these weapons, how often do you employ feints? Now, I'm sure when you were playing through Elden Ring DLC, you were curious about this giant dead dragon, who happens to be one of, if not the biggest in the entire game. But a detail on this dragon that a lot of people will likely miss is the giant weapon coming out of the back of his head that likely killed him, which begs the question of, what exactly is this thing? It appears to be some kind of spear or long shaft of a weapon covered in stone, but also with a rounded out green inside with no apparent details. And there are a few pretty cool possibilities of what this might be. Firstly, the description of the meteoric ore blade tells us that it's a piece of an arrowhead of the old gods, who had a vast arsenal, and the blade itself is gigantic, so perhaps the weapon that killed the dragon was one of the old gods' arrows. But another possibility that I think is really cool is the fact that this thing has a hollowed out inside suggests that it could be a siphon, particularly for dragon's blood. After all, there is a large basin right there, and an altar of dragon communion where you partake of their blood and hearts. So even if that wasn't the weapon that killed it, it's still gigantic. So who could have crafted such a thing? There's a story to find here. So what do you think this thing is? Who do you think killed the dragon? And why is it all so big? But here's a bonus one. See if you can see what's wrong with this picture. I'll let you take a few seconds, so give it a look. Did you notice it? Well, if you didn't, the Black Jail Knight Greatsword does not cast a shadow. Yeah, I have no idea why that is. I guess they forgot to render something in. But as it stands, the thing is entirely translucent when it comes to the sun. And I know that's completely game-changing stuff, but it'd be interesting to see if you guys can come up with a lore reason as to why that is. As you know how these FromSoftware games are. Just like the Heineken bottle in Dark Souls 2, everything is for a reason. Anyways though guys, that is going to do it for the video today. If I showed you something that you didn't already know, then don't forget to like the video and subscribe if you're new around here. Once again, y'all do me a favor and go support Undisputed over on Webtoons. But with all that, I will catch you in the next one.